You're very welcome to our podcast on pay transparency. My name is Louise O'Byrne and I'm a partner here at Arthur Cox. So some stats before we begin. As you know, the current gender pay gap in Ireland is in the region of 11%, whereas the pay gap across Europe is in the region of 13%, just over 13% when it was last reported. When you read the directive and you look at the rationale for the directive, it is very clear that there's still a sense within the European Union that pay discrimination exists, that bias exists in relation to pay determinations, and it is noted in the directive the disproportionate impact that the pandemic had on the female workforce, particularly as it relates to pay. So, as you know, we've had gender pay gap reporting in Ireland since 2022, and a lot of organisations, the vast majority of organisations in Ireland as of now, with 50 or more employees, are reporting on their gender pay gap.
Mhm.
Employers will obviously be asking themselves the question, well, what is new? What does pay transparency mean for me? What changes do we need to be mindful of? I'm joined today by my colleague, Hannah O'Farrell. Hannah, can you briefly bring our listeners through that?
Sure. So I suppose Ireland has had that mandatory gender pay gap reporting since 2022, like you say, and that largely does meet the requirements of the directive. But there are going to be some important new requirements that will require legislation. So first thing to say is that the public reporting obligations are for larger organisations, at least initially. So that's employers with 250 employees plus. But there will be changes across the board, even for smaller organisations. The key ones that we want to talk about today are, first of all, um, pay transparency prior to employment. So that means that employers will have to provide information about the salary level or range, either in the job advertisement or in advance of the interview, so that the candidate knows what the salary is for the job without having to ask for it. Likewise, employers will be prohibited from actually asking an applicant, what was your previous salary? The idea being that if there was some unequal treatment in a prior employment, they're not carrying that forward into their new employer. The second thing then is pay transparency once you're in employment. So you've passed the interview, you're an employee or you're an existing employee. Employers will have to provide gender neutral, easily accessible information, a description of the criteria that's used to determine your pay level. And the whole idea of this directive is this focus on pay transparency and also career progression transparency. So the information exchange is really a key part of this directive. And that brings us nicely onto this right to request an information breakdown. So this is the one that will apply initially for employers with 250 employees or more. This means that an employee will be able to ask their employer for information concerning their individual pay level and the average pay level broken down, not just by sex, which we see through the gender pay gap reporting obligations, and those obligations will still exist. But under the directive, the information will have to be broken down by category of worker, i.e., workers performing the same work and workers performing work of equal value to them. And an employer has to provide this information within 2 months of receiving a request. And also, an employer has to remind employees of their right to request this information. So you can imagine a situation where this reminder email goes out and that invites an influx of pay information requests. So I suppose it begs the question, how will this really work in practice? It's going to involve a significant consideration of how to define, what categories of workers will be and how those categories of workers will be made out. So maybe, Louise, you could cast some light on that.
Yeah. And I think that's the piece of the directive that most of our clients are struggling with, or certainly challenging themselves about at the moment, in terms of, and look, it's not a one size fits all. Every organization is different. Every organization manages their people differently, manages their pay structures differently. So where do you start as an organization? It depends really on the sophistication of the organization to begin with. So unionized environments, for example, a lot of the time are quite used to a fairly significant level of transparency when it comes to pay. Roles are banded, roles are graded. There's a very set formula for negotiating
Mm.
pay increases across the piece, for moving through the bands on an annualized basis, or as it relates to CPI or, inflationary related increases. A lot of those organizations have very structured positions in place. All of those organizations also historically, ever before we spoke about pay transparency, were evaluating their roles, and there were IR mechanisms by which you could challenge your status or where you fell within an organization. That's one subset of our clients. Another subset of our clients are smaller, they don't have the same resources, and they make their decisions around pay largely on a discretionary basis. So Hannah's doing exceptionally well. Hannah's going to get a pay rise, Hannah's going to get a bonus, whatever the case may be, case by case, entirely discretionary. And that's actually the piece that the Transparency Directive is going to be looking at. That's going to be brought into the sharpest focus, because Europe is convinced that a lot of those decisions are inherently biased and inherently biased as against women. So when you are an organization that makes pay decisions largely based on discretion, you are now going to be called to question the exercise of that discretion, or what factors are brought into consideration in dealing with that as it relates to categories of workers. So how do you define your categories? You spoke about the same work or work of equal value. They are concepts that have been in existence forever and a day through the equal pay legislation under the Employment Equality Act, but not as it relates to siloing your workforce. So you look at your organizational structure, and is there a sense where it makes sense that somebody at executive level, at one level down, is that easily definable, or do we have roles that sit on a wide different variety of levels through the organization? So at first instance, you need to understand who's in your organization. You need to understand their roles. So a job analysis needs to be conducted. Lots of organizations, for example, don't have detailed job descriptions. So what exactly are people doing, and how can we analyze that to define what is the same work or what is work of equal value? That does involve quite a bit of work if it's not something that you are doing intuitively as a matter of course. And then what are we aligning from a role perspective? Because it's not going to be the case that we've 25 accountants, we've 25 HR people, and we've 25 people working on the factory line. Like, no organization is that simplistic. So that is going to involve a fair level of subjectivity, a fair level of consistency, and a fair level of collaboration across the workforce. Are you applying a job evaluation criteria? That's very detailed. It can often be expensive. It will involve invariably bringing in third-party support. Some organizations have historically done that. They've engaged Hay and done Hay evaluation reports, etc. But that's not for everybody. And it's the gold-plated standard in terms of categorizing your employees. But I'm not convinced that that is actually what's going to be happening across the piece. And then obviously, as you said at the outset, there does need to be a sense of, well, what are our pay grades? What are our pay bands? How do you move between those? And what does career progression look like for me in an organization? And a lot of the time, organizations are not that definitive in terms of those factors. And now they will, for the first time under the directive, need to articulate that so that people understand success for me and progression for me in this organization can be achieved having regard for the criteria put in place. So it does involve thinking, it does involve collaboration, I think. So if this is a case, and we talk about implementation, we talk about project teams, etc., it is a really bad idea, in my view, to just assign this project to somebody sitting over there who's not embedded in the organization, without collaboration with people managers, potentially with people, with the workforce more generally. It will invariably lead to problems, in my view. When you talk about the annual request and what's read between the lines in foot of an annual request, etc., collaboration in terms of this categorization piece and bringing everybody, not everybody, that would be unworkable, but bringing the important people into the room when you're making those assessments is really important. And when you have it done, it does sound like a turgid exercise, but if you do it right at the outset, it would be a rinse and repeat thereafter. But it does involve a thoughtful exercise with the right people in the room at the outset, and that now is the time to be doing that and thinking carefully about that. We then moved on in your discussion about what's changing to the fact that there will be a different legal consequence potentially. So we all know that equal pay is something that everybody has been entitled to for many, many years. But the law is changing in terms of how one will potentially progress a claim and what employers will be held to account for if a claim is ultimately progressed. Can you briefly touch on that?
Yeah, sure. So I guess really what this directive means is that there's going to be way more information available to employees. and the nature of that information is going to be different. It's going to probably more accurately identify the underlying cause for a gender pay gap. And it's going to require a lot more work on the part of an employer. And it's going to lead inevitably to more claims, in our view, because where there's more information available in relation to pay, it's going to give rise to more questions around pay and more WRC claims. So, taking a look at how the directive impacts those claims on the ground, just briefly, you can see again the emphasis towards transparency and the emphasis towards a more pro-employee attitude to pay claims. So we know that through the directive, the requirement to identify a comparator is going. So many HR professionals will know that typically the requirement to identify a comparator has been a stumbling block for many employees in bringing home an equal pay claim. And that requirement's going, so an employee no longer has to identify an appropriate comparator. They can identify a hypothetical comparator. They can identify, someone who used to work for the business who they consider to be an appropriate comparator. So we can see a lot of latitude there. Likewise, then the burden of proof is changing. So typically, an equal pay claim involves an employer kind of sitting back and waiting for the employee to show kind of prima facie a case of discrimination, arising from which then the burden would shift onto the employer and they'll have to rebut that presumption. Under the directive, the burden actually starts off in the ballpark of the employer and they have to explain, that the treatment was not unfair and the burden of proof is on them. And then finally, in this kind of WRC adjudication, third party objective view place, there's this idea of intersectionality. So that means that where a WRC adjudication officer say, here's a case based on gender related discrimination, they can actually take account of another protected ground. So they can take account of the fact that maybe the gender is at play, but also maybe family status is at play. And that allows an adjudication officer to see the case in the round and decide whether there is discrimination arising based on maybe a combination of factors rather than one factor on its own. So in practice, that means that an employee, they might not have enough to bring a gender-related pay discrimination claim, but when taken with another ground, the picture painted by the employee might look different and the adjudication officer can take account of that. So again, we can see that focus on really the enforceability of the directive, not only the information that's being provided being increased, but also the way that information can be used for a discrimination claim having a big impact. So I suppose, Louise, what can employers do now in preparation of the directive?
Yeah, and look, when you talk about what the landscape will look like post implementation, and the fact that there will undoubtedly be bigger obligations on the employer, it is really, really important that you get off on this on the right foot, because there could be unintended consequences by rushing into particularly job categorization, by rushing into the evaluation that you bring as an organization to bear in relation to pay decisions and progression.
Mm-hmm.
So they need to be really thoughtful decisions. So you need to understand your workforce. That's absolutely essential. You need to bring the right people into the room at the right time to become engaged on this topic, because it is not going away. And then you need to communicate effectively, both with the right people in the right room, and then when you've decided what your message is and how you're moving forward within an organization, distilling that internally so that this becomes part and parcel of the way you do business. There's not a cynicism around what you're communicating and how you're going about pay-related decisions. It's very clear, it's very digestible, because the directive and a lot of the legal commentary around the directive is not very clear and is not often very digestible. So that is the worst place you want an employee to be in. So it is actually engaging your people now and determining your communications plan in advance of June so that it's abundantly clear what the next steps will be for an organization and how you will be doing things on a go-forward basis. I think they're fundamentally the most important takeaways, or certainly what I see working well within organizations that are moving towards pay transparency readiness as we speak.
Thanks, Louise. Well, that's a nice note for us to end on, I think, for the moment. And thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions in relation to the Pay Transparency Directive, please feel free to get in touch with Louise or myself, or indeed anyone on the employment group at Arthur Cox with whom you usually make contact. Thank you.